And Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and God, amen. All right, this is our last week of James. We're done, and then we're going to take a couple week break, maybe more than a couple weeks, probably almost a month and a half. Just a lot of things going on, and then we will restart in the fall. Okay, so don't lose the habit of conversation. All right. All right. So always just kind of quick recap. Last week we really focused on, or James really focused on, where the divisions come, right? And we said that divisions come kind of from inside of us, and a lot of times the shadows in our life. So like if I'm unaware that like I deal with a lot of greed or judgment or covetousness, where I'm always going after what, things that other people have, right? Those things drive me to do certain things, right? Or if I struggle with, a sense of value, I can act in a certain way that is trying to draw a sense of like false validation, right? Trying to make myself feel okay. So all these different things all like live in the shadow of our hearts, and when we're not careful, they drive us. And a lot of times that leads to divisions among us, right? When we've seen church communities break apart because some key people within the church are unaware of what's going on inside of them, and they can create a lot of division in the church. And then James went on to really talk about, okay, well, how do we respond to this? And kind of the big thing that he emphasized last week was that humility goes a long way, because when we take on a humility, one, we're more likely to ask for help and seek guidance. We're also like more likely to kind of look inside and say, okay, what's going on? Like it could be me, rather than somebody who is unaware of the shadows in their lives, causing all this havoc, and is prideful. Then they're ultimately going to say, well, it's their fault, and they did this, and so they wash their hands clean, right? So humility goes a long way in avoiding the quarrels. And also humility serves as like a safeguard to us judging other people and saying, I was just saying that a prideful person is going to point the finger at everybody else. Somebody who is humble is going to say, okay, well, the source could be. All right. There's a little bit of feedback sound, so I'm just going to mute, but if you guys want to speak, of course, just unmute yourselves. All right, so we'll start with our questions for this week. When you think of corruption, right, and especially like corruption, sometimes you see it from like up top, like we see it in politics, or even like we see it within the church, right? What is so frustrating about corruption?
There's somebody else.
Okay, yeah, I've heard somebody else.
Often they don't want to change.
So often they don't want to change.
Sometimes it's done behind in the quiet. It like they're not upfront about it.
Yeah, right. So they're not upfront about it. And what like why is that so frustrating?
They always make justification for their actions.
So they always like throw you a bone and say like, well, it's because of this and this and this, but like behind it, like, okay, you're lying. Right? There's an African adage which says, when the elephants fight, the grass gets tumbled. And so it's their way of saying like, when people within government and the politicians of the country are corrupt and acting in a poor way, right, the little people get trampled. Right. So corruption is tough. But I think one of the things with corruption at least for me, that is so tough, is that sometimes you feel like powerless in order to be able to fix it, right? You look at it, you see it, you can identify it, and you experience kind of the consequences of it. But like sometimes you have no
Control.
control of it. That's one of the most things. That's one of the things I find like most about corruption. So question, right? So it's kind of like flip and say, okay, why is revenge so appealing? Because I don't know about you guys, but I will admit that like I when I see corruption, like there's a part of me that wants to take revenge.
Angry because of angry with that situation. And want to fix an improper situation.
Mhm. So it's a way that we deal with our anger.
It allows you to have control.
Okay, so it's a way to gain something. Good. Why is taking revenge dangerous?
Why is it dangerous?
Yeah. Why is seeking revenge dangerous? Or why can't it be dangerous?
Sometimes a person can be obsessed by that, by
Hmm.
wanting to
So it can be all consuming.
think hyper focused.
It can escalate and get so out of hand.
All right. Can easily get out of hand.
So yes, that command and not to take revenge by ourselves.
So it's against God to say, you know, for us to take revenge.
In the process, it can hurt more than just the person or people that they're focused on taking the revenge on. It could hurt themselves as well.
Definitely. We can hold ourselves. All right, here's my last question. Where is God in the middle of corruption?
We can help the freedom to behave whatever we want. So
Okay.
it's part of our freedom that he let us do whatever we want.
Okay. I'm gonna play devil's advocate. Okay, but when there are leaders who are corrupted, which even like we look at and we say, okay, God has put them in place. Where's God in corruption?
Are you watching to see what the ultimate decisions are that we make? Listening in.
I'm just gonna ask a question.
Ugh, that's the worst.
What?
That's the worst.
What's the worst?
Corrupt leaders. When you know that God, like as you said, God like has put them or allowed for them to be in that position. Ooh, it's the
Mhm.
worst.
Hey,
It-
Abuna,
Yeah, George.
I put your devil down. People that follow direction.
Yeah, I just read your chat. You're right. Like people don't follow, direction. Like when there's corruption, like people aren't following direction.
Yeah, made sense.
No.
But I want to know why. I want to know why.
I couldn't tell you, George. I think everybody's got to answer that question individually.
Okay.
No, that's a tough one. All right. Well, let's jump into our section for today. We're going to jump, chapter 5, and we're going to read verses 1 through 6. Yeah.
And once you answer that.
What, what's my answer about where he's gotten? That's what we're going to discuss in the chapter. All right. All right. So, let's start. I'll go ahead and get us started. All right, read 1 through 6. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver are corroded, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasures in the last days. Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. You have lived on the earth in pleasure and luxury. You have fattened your hearts as in the day of slaughter. You have condemned, you have murdered the just. He does not resist. All right. So, just a little bit of context about these verses. So he said that James is writing, he's the bishop of Jerusalem, and he's writing to Jews that live outside of Jerusalem. And he's encouraging them to stand fast in their faith, but not just to stand fast in their faith, but to make sure that their works are mirroring of their faith, right? It's a big theme of James throughout the book, right? So he's writing to the Jews, and the Jews, like outside of Jerusalem, they come together because they're still in this process of, like, some of them hold on to the laws of Moses, some of them not so much, but there's still like a cultural glue that brings them together. Just like, half of Egypt immigrated here, like we find ourselves in pods together, right? So it's very natural to find, a bunch of Jews together. Now, within these groups of Jews, some are wealthy and some are poor, right? There's the mix. And while I don't want to go through it now, there is some historical evidence that in the years prior to James writing his book, that there was a severe famine in the land. And a severe famine in those days would have taken years to recover. And in this, and so there's thought that James is writing to them in this time of recovery where things are still difficult and people are trying to navigate how to recover from the famine. And one of the things that would happen is that richer Jews might employ other Jews who are struggling. And I mean, we see it's not far-fetched to think that, because it's what we see today, right? We have like somebody who owns a company, and what does he do? Like hires other people from the church, right? So we see this sort of, act happening today, and it's likely what was happening back then. And when a letter like this is written, it's often read in church. It's read when everybody gathered together. One person would read it. And so picture yourself that in the same congregation or in the same group of people who are listening to the reading of this letter, you have, the rich and the poor. And this is what's being read out loud. Now, in the first 6 verses that we read, James is clearly directing his message to those who are rich, right? Knowing that they were probably employing those who are less fortunate than them, and they were employing them in their fields. So to the rich, he's kind of looking at them and saying, like, all right, make sure that you're being fair to those that you employ. And what he captured here is that clearly the injustices that were going on were so bad that they made it all the way back to Jerusalem, and kind of came with some force in order for James to make sure that he addresses it in his letter. So it's a big issue that's going on. And so he sends a lot of messages to those who are rich. And he says, don't be fooled in thinking that your misdeeds are going to be hidden and go unpunished, right? Which is one of the things that can drive us nuts about corruption. When you see it up top, you look at the people and you're like, they're acting as if nothing can touch them. And to me, that's one of the most frustrating things. Is they can act as if nothing can touch them. But James reminds them that the shouts for justice coming out of those who are struggling always reach the ears of the Lord, right? And the Lord will respond. And he responds, in verse 4, if we read it, it's on the screen. It says, "Indeed, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out. And the cries of the reapers have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth." Okay? What's the difference between Sabbath and Sabaoth?
No idea.
I will bring it up. I appreciate the honesty too. Here in person, we're shrugging our shoulders, we're not sure. All right? What's the difference between Sabbath and Sabaoth?
It's the first time I've actually heard that word, so
We also we read it in the Agbeah. Holy, 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 Lord of Sabaoth. All right?
gotcha. Yeah, but so word doesn't stick.
All right. Let's start with the easy one. What's Sabbath?
The Jews' holy day.
Okay, it's a Jews' holy day, right? Sabbath was the day of rest. All right. Sabaoth is sometimes translated the Lord of hosts. All right. Host of what?
Like the whole creatures are offering his hosts.
Okay. Which creatures
Yeah.
then? You're on, right? But which creatures? Who's in heaven? Who's there?
The angels.
The angels. Okay, the archangels, all the heavenly creatures. When you think back biblically, when the Lord sent out angels, and even like think back to Old Testament, what did the angels do? When he sent the angel into the camp, right, of the enemy, what did the angel do? They were warriors. They were warriors. So this reference here of the Lord of Sabaoth is to say that like the cries of those who are suffering reach my ears, and I'm the Lord of Sabaoth. I'm the Lord over all the heavenly angels and archangels who are warriors at the same time. They carry out the will of the Lord. And so it's a warning to those who are leaders to say like, okay, their cries are coming to me and I see it all. And I have this sort of army. I'm the Lord of hosts. I'm the commander of the heavenly hosts. Right? So it's a warning. It's a warning to say, you think that you're doing this and getting away with it, but I see it. Right? I see it. And then he goes on to warn in a different way. He warns the rich, like, and this is not just for the rich here, but this is for all of us. Because by even just virtue of living here in the States, we are rich people. Right? If we're honest with ourselves, we're rich. Even the kid who lives in a dorm room who eats ramen every week, right? That's a rich kid. We are all rich. And one of the, I guess, Achilles heel or the pitfalls in being privileged is that we tend to trust in our possessions. And we think that our possessions afford us a degree of safety. And so James here is saying like, okay, careful, you who are rich. And he gives them some imagery to think about, right? He mentions gold and silver. And he says these will corrode. Why gold and silver does he choose? Because gold and silver are known as non-corroding metals. And says then even these metals are going to corrode. Your garments, which was a sign of wealth, will be moth eaten, and your riches, which we're talking about individuals who are rich and had farms, okay, so their produce that they gather is going to become rotten. So James is saying like all these different things that you're trusting in will be put to the side. One day they're not going to be there to protect you. They're not going to serve as a buffer. They are a false sense of safety and security, because in the day when all of them are taken away, judgment is here, and there's nothing you can do to run. Right? Day of judgment is a real day. And regardless of whether or not corruption is exposed while the individual is living or not living, judgment is coming. Right? So you ask me, well, I think James is answering. God sees it. And he sees it plays out. Sometimes out of his wisdom, like he will intervene. Sometimes he lets it play out. But even if it plays out and the individual dies, right, before we catch on to what's going on, like it comes to the light. And I'll give you a recent example. And this one like always stings when we talk about it, at least stings me, is Ravi Zacharias, right? He was a very prolific author, an apologist. He did so much for the Christian faith, you know, with regards to going into all these different third world countries and hostile environments, and he preached the faith. But he did so, and behind the scenes, he was involved in sexual misconduct, and he was abusing many women, and it was horrible. There was some evidence, like things that were kind of came out in the last few years of his life, but nothing actually was believed because of his reputation as a worldwide apologist. He was so well respected. But after his death, it all came out. And it was devastating. And there were so many shattered pieces to pick up. Nothing that we do is hidden. It comes out. Leader or not leader, like it will come out. Because we believe in the God of light. And light will always expose everything. Any thoughts or reflections, questions? All right.
I think it's still so confusing. I wanted to think, okay, I think that's looking at it through the lens of justice. But I guess long-term justice. But yeah, I mean, I just think it's so confusing as to why God would allow that for the time being. And as you said, we just sort of rest in his, sovereign judgment and in his wisdom. But I think those are.
What do you mean allow this, like allow it for the time being?
He allows, leaders, like you said, about Ravi Zacharias. I mean, he allowed him to continue his ministry during his lifetime. But also, I mean, the fact that he was exposed after his death was a reason for probably many people to, point and say evil of God and, of believers. So it just, I mean, I think like, yes, from the perspective of the victim, saying, okay, God will bring this person to justice is one thing. But then, from the perspective of, another believer to say like why would God allow this and then see what like his enemies are able to say about him because of of what Ravi Zacharias did. I mean, I just think there's so much that we just don't know and understand, and it's very hard.
I agree. Like, and you're right, I am looking at it like through the lens of justice. I think there are so many layers to this, and so many different ways to look at it. You know, I think just in response to your comments, like, you know, there were opportunities along the way for repentance, right? And unfortunately, to the best that we can see, like, those opportunities weren't seized. There were opportunities for his organization to really do a thorough job in investigating allegations that came up while he was alive, right? So there's opportunities for good. They weren't seized. But even like in the aftermath of it all, you know, I was just listening to an apology that one of his close co-workers and co-authors came out and apologized to everybody for misleading and misrepresenting who he was. And you know, in their apology, it was moving because, like, they really brought to life so many elements of the Christian faith that they defended, right? They spoke about truth. They spoke about, you know, they spoke on behalf of those who were hurt as a result of his actions. They spoke about, like, misrepresenting, you know, and misleading so many other ministry partners. And they asked for forgiveness. So in the same, like, in the same aftermath, you do see people who are very genuine and sincere, using the tools that God gave us to deal with such a bad situation. There's so many layers to the story, you know, and you know, for us to look at, but it's a tough one. But I think it is an example where, you know, a leader was misleading and misrepresenting and acting corruptly, and justice ultimately, like, it came out. It doesn't erase the hurt that was caused, but we see the process. And that's kind of the angle that I'm looking at the story, though I think there's so many layers. All right. So James talks to the rich in the beginning, and then he kind of turns his mindset, or his focus, to those who are being oppressed by the rich. Right? Can somebody read? We're going to read verses 7 through 11.
Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and the latter rain. Ye also be patient. Establish your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door.
In the screen, please.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I'm going to take it. I'm going to pick it up until it unfreezes. My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. Indeed, we count them as blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. Right. So he's clearly talking to those who are oppressed, who are, like, under those who are corrupt, those who are being, you know, these are the individuals who are being taken advantage of. And he sees that this is a difficult situation. So he's offering them some instruction, right? One of the things he says, and it is in verse, where is it? Verse 8. You also be patient, establish your hearts for the coming of the Lord. What do you think he means when he says establish your hearts?
Be ready
Okay, be ready for what?
for judgment.
Okay. One thought, be ready for judgment. What do you think he's indicating when he says establish your hearts?
He's talking about how like farmer has to be patient for the crop to grow.
Okay,
It's not like a overnight process.
okay,
So I think maybe establish your hearts means like kind of like almost like your growth,
okay,
like your spiritual growth. Like it takes time, but like
Okay.
you have to be diligent.
okay,
So you are feeling oppressed, so in the judgment day, you will see the person that is oppressing you is receiving his just judgment.
okay.
So we feel that way.
So an element is like, okay, just wait, because like you said at the beginning, like he said, okay, don't revenge, revenge is mine, right? And what you're saying, Mary, is that like, okay, just like the imagery of the crops, like have to be patient in the process. And we're saying like one of the frustrating things of like knowing about corruption is you feel powerless, right? So he's kind of wielding this whole picture together. Like, yes, you may be powerless to reverse the situation. Yes, you could be tempted to take revenge. But if you take revenge too early, it's like the farmer who harvests his crops before the early rain and the latter rain, right? So he's talking about seasons. He's talking, so there's, let's say, I'm no farmer, but like there's 4 seasons, right? And so he's saying like, wait for the seasons to come and go. And even if things are tight, like a farmer knows, like, even if things are tight, if I pull the crops early, it's going to be a mess, right? If we don't wait for God to act, it's going to be a mess, right? If I take revenge into my own hands. So this idea of establishing our hearts, right, in the midst of like kind of being on the receiving end of corruption, is about grounding our thinking and also like grounding our emotions, because we know that like when we're oppressed and when we're frustrated, we're likely to kind of act out, take matters into our own hands, right? Our emotions flare, we get really angry, and revenge is a great way to offload our anger. But we need to establish our hearts. In what? Right? We need to ground our emotions and our thinking in truth. So what's the truth? What you're saying earlier, which is the Lord said, vengeance is mine. That's a truth. Right? It's a spiritual truth that he's telling us. Right? It's a truth that the cries of the oppressed reach the ears of the Lord. Right? It's a truth that, like, of all people in the situation, the one person we should really fear is not the one who's oppressing us, but as it said in the New Testament, don't fear those who kill the body, but fear the one who, after the body is killed, can take the person and put them into an eternal fire. Right? These are all truths that Scripture tells us. And when we kind of look at this picture of how God like acts in the situation, right? They help us establish our hearts. And establishing our hearts, right, prevents us from acting out in anger. And one of the things that he says is right after this, he says, establish your hearts from the coming of for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Meaning like judgment is coming. He's going to act in the situation. He is not going to just remain silent. He's like, sometimes we perceive him as being silent, but he will always rectify the situations. Right? So judgment is at hand. Verse 9, do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. So what James is saying is like, one of the things like when we're irritated, when we feel we've been wronged, it's very easy because we can't take down the one who is corrupt. Who am I going to take out my frustration with? The ones who are on the same playing field as me. Right? We offload, we transfer our frustration onto the next person. And then we cause another problem. We have the big problem. Then I cause another problem with my brother or sister or spouse or whatever the situation, or a good friend, when I begin to pick a fight with them out of my frustration of being wrong. So he's saying, like, be careful. Because, okay, judgment is coming. And if now all of a sudden you picked a pointless fight with your brother, okay, you're going to have to deal with that. So he's saying, like, be careful. But then the other thing that helps us establish our hearts is we need to look at good examples of those who suffer wrong. Learning from people who have suffered well, who have been oppressed, who have been wronged, but handled it with integrity, handled it like in such a mature way. Those are the ones that we need to look at because they provide a roadmap. What is our biggest problem when like we feel wronged? We can go around asking different people like, okay, here's my situation, like, what should I do? And it's always like nice to hear from somebody who's like, yeah, you have been wrong. Yeah, this is really bad. Yeah, you should do something about it, right? They begin to instigate us. And we're like, yeah, I've been wrong. Yeah, this is really bad. Yeah, I'm going to take revenge. I'm going to do this, right? We begin to take matters in our own hands. It does us no good. But when we look to good examples and we surround ourselves by people who have dealt with it and dealt with it well, then we're more likely to deal with it appropriately, right? To suffer with it, right? And the examples that he says is look at the prophets. They suffered, but they suffered well. You know, Jeremiah was a prophet who like hated preaching. And every time he preached, he was punished for it. But he did it because that's what God told him to do. Right? Look at Job, who like had everything, lost everything. Friends came and like challenged him. He dealt with the suffering well. And at the end, he was rewarded. Right? So we need to look at good examples. We need to, find who are our positive mentors, who have been down the same road as me and made it through and did it well. Because when I surround myself around by those individuals, by those influences, then I kind of pick up these virtues of what it is to persevere and to endure through these challenges. And at the end of it, all right, we see in their situation that God acted compassionate towards them. Like in the end, he like resolved the situation. And so I'm reminded that yes, this is difficult. Yes, it feels like it's taking a long time, but I have a compassionate and merciful God, which is the very last line in this section of verses where he says that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. Right? And we talked about the Lord's compassion in our last series, but just to remind ourselves, like, we tend to determine whether God is compassionate or not based on the moment, right? But we forget that his compassion is seen over time. And I'll give you an example. John chapter 9, the man born blind. If I asked you, did the Lord have compassion on the blind man? What would you say? Yes. How? He gave him his sight. It was an act of compassion. But it was an act of compassion after years of struggle, 2 years of suffering. But we look at the whole story, we say the Lord acted compassion with him. Same thing with me. Like, I struggle, I suffer, but there is a purpose, and there's something that the Lord, there's an, as you're saying, like, at the end, we see what it was intended by the Lord, and that's where we see his mercy and compassion. Any questions?
It's also slow for anger, so.
Yes. The Hebrew, those you may or may not remember from the last series, the idea of the Lord being slow to anger, right? Because it's got a long nose. That's the Hebrew translation. Right? The Lord is slow to anger. All right. Well, let's move on to verse 12. I'm not going to spend much time here, but above all, my brethren, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or with any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no, lest you fall into judgment, right? And this is just kind of one of these verses that re-emphasizes this overall theme that James has been pushing in this book, right? That our faith be tied to our actions, and our actions are tied to our faith. They're one and the same, right? And so he's saying, like, just let your yes be yes and your no be no. Like, just be straightforward, right? And just like we have today, like, these sayings like, I swear on my mother's grave. Right? So when we're really trying to make somebody like believe us. But if we just say the truth all the time, then I don't need to swear on my mother's grave, right? I can just, say, yes, this is what it is, right? So we need to become people of integrity. And it's that same idea of our faith and our works, right? Being people of integrity.
Maybe wishy-washy.
Yeah, let's not be wishy-washy, right? It's like when you sign up for something, then go, right? Attend. But if you don't sign up, then don't attend, right? Just be like in all these little things, like we forget, like, okay, this is how I become a person of integrity. And like when you've had like multiple experience of somebody and you describe them as like, if they say they're going to do it, they're going to do it. Don't worry. Right? How do you know that? It's only when the person over time has said, yes, I will do this, and they do this. Yes, I will do this, and they do this. No, I'm not going to do that, and they don't. Right? They have a track record. And that's why you're able to say, don't worry. If they said they're going to do it, they're going to do it. Right? So that's the type of people that James is encouraging us to become. All right. Let's take on verses 13 through 18. Somebody can read.
Is anyone among you suffering? Oh, wait.
I'm sorry.
There. Let him pray. Is anyone cheerful? Let him sing psalms. Is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise him up. And if he has committed sins, he will be forgiven.
Sorry.
Confess your trespasses to one another and pray for one another, that you may be healed. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3 years and 6 months. And he prayed again, and the heaven gave rain, and the earth produced its fruit.
All right. So these verses more or less serve as a foundation of our understanding of what the unction of the sick is, right? One of our sacraments. And it's rooted in this very real belief that Christ offers healing powers. Like he cares for our physical ailments. And we see that because when he walked on this earth, he healed the sick. Right? So that's the foundation. But we also see like what Christ did pour out into his disciples and the apostles, and not just in the New Testament, but we also saw this action in the Old Testament, right? So in the New Testament, we see, okay, Peter walked into the temple and he said, gold and silver I do not have, but what I have I give to you in the name of Jesus Christ, rise up and eat, right? So there was a care with the physical ailment, right? When we go to the Old Testament, we see Elijah, the Shunammite woman, and the Shunammite woman whose son died, and Elijah stretched himself out over and brought him back to life, right? So we see God caring about the physical ailments that we deal with. We see it in more recent times. In Pope Pius VI, he was known for so many miracles, right? Healing so many people, caring. We also have Father Lazarus and Tony. Like, these are individuals that we see like healing power, that we see them being used as a conduit for God's healing power. Not that they themselves do any of the healing, it is God, but we see kind of that pathway, so to speak. And so this is where the belief, like kind of the understanding or the theology, if you will, of the unction of the sick comes from. Like, God truly cares about our physical ailments. And not only does he care, he uses individuals, right, as a vector for his healing power. Which is why James was kind of referring and saying, like, okay, look, Elijah, beforehand he says, call the elders of the church, right? The elders of the church were seen as righteous men, like, individuals who are really who sanctified themselves, and in their sanctification, the Lord was using them to do amazing things. This is our understanding of like the saints, and why they were able to do the miracles that they did was because they sanctified themselves. They kept themselves for the Lord. And the Lord used them. But while we see amazing things, James reminds us that these are still just human beings. And he's like, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, right? He was human. But he was a human who chose to live in a very, very radical way. And as a result of that, there was a divine power that came from him to do amazing things. So this is the idea between unction of the sick. And even though now, like, okay, we do the unction of the sick, and there's a bit of like, okay, well, what's really happening? Praying these 7 prayers over the oil, light the candles, and then we anoint ourselves with oil. Like, is there power? Is there not power? Like, there is power, right? But we have to see like our shortcomings. Maybe like, okay, like as a priest, like, I'm not as sanctified as Elisha, the prophet. And maybe as an individual, like, you have like your doubts and skepticism. But just because like there are our own human weaknesses that play into it right now, doesn't mean that there isn't power there. There is power. This is kind of the lineage of it. We have present day examples of it. So for those who carry it out with faith, like, there is power, not just, and it's not isolated just to the physical healing, it's also poured out into the spiritual healing. Because our understanding of unction of the sick is, yes, we pray for the physical body, but we also pray for the forgiveness of sins. And one of the things that St. James says here, which in this version, it's not great. It says, is anyone among you sick? In other translations, and I think you'll see it in the Orthodox Study Bible, it says, is anyone among you wasting away? So we're talking about like somebody who's at the very end of life, right? That's where they would call and ask for this, to be prayed over and anointed with oil. For all of this, whether it's for physical healing or spiritual healing, it's all done with the focus of salvation. And we're all, everything that we do is trying to get us, it is focused on working for our salvation. Any questions? about this or our choice. Last two verses in the book of James says, brethren, if anyone among you wanders from the truth and someone turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. It's a beautiful kind of reminder of how important it is to focus on those who are lost in the church. But what I think is interesting, just offer up a bit of perspective, like so much of the book of James is really focused on kind of like my inner self, right? Faith, the shadows of my life, how I use my tongue, how I go through trials and tribulations, how I endure when I'm oppressed. Well, like we talk about so many things that really focus on my, the inner person. And at the very end, it says, brethren, if any among you wanders from the truth, and someone turns him back, let him know that he who turns a sinner from the error of his ways will save a soul from death. Right? So focus on the inner life, and then go with it. Right? So we always need to prepare ourselves in order to go and to bring it. Because our goal is to save and to bring people into this relationship with God. But a big part of that is how I conduct myself and how I focus on my inner self. Right, and we're done with James. Any last questions? It's been a blessed series. Let's go ahead and end in prayer. In the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one God, amen. Thank you, Lord, for this day. Thank you for this opportunity to come together to discuss this book, which has challenged us in so many different ways, to really look at our inner person, to search the chambers of our heart, to discover the shadows that are lying dormant, that cause so much havoc in our life, that can really be the place where sin flourishes. But Lord, you are there with us, walking with us to our inner person. Cleanse our minds, our hearts, our actions. Let our inside be reflected by how we live externally in this world. So thank you, Lord, for the various ways that you have challenged us to grow in our spiritual lives. Help each person here. And as we take a break for the rest of the summer, we ask, Lord, that you would guard our minds and our hearts, and that you would bring us back together to continue to search your scriptures, which are in our sessions of our sing to Ecclesiastes from the beginning, place as we say, our Father, our Lord in heaven, hallowed be thy kingdom come, on earth as it is
Give us
in heaven.